back to the Medieval Archives Podcast, the podcast for medieval news, history, and entertainment. I'm your host, Gary, aka The Archivist. Now, today we're headed back to the 14th century with our special guest, Stephen Spinks, to talk about Edward II. Now, Stephen wrote a biography on Edward titled Edward II, The Man, A Doomed Inheritance. Now, if you have any questions or comments, or if you have a topic you're dying to hear for the show, send them over to podcast@medievalarchives.com. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a rating over on iTunes. It's an easy way to support the show, and it helps others find it while you're searching. It's real simple. Point your browser to medievalarchives.com/iTunes, and you can leave a rating, and if you have time, leave a review as well. And thanks to everyone who has already left a rating and a review. Now, I had a fantastic talk with Stephen about his writing career and about Edward II, and I have a whole new outlook on Edward II and his reign and his fate. You can find all the links to Stephen's book, his website, and his social media at medievalarchives.com/78. So with that, let's get started with this great interview. Today on the podcast, we're joined by Stephen Spinks, and he is a member of the National Trust, a manager at the National Trust, and he is the author of a new book on Edward II. So Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Gary. Thanks for having me.
All right, so the National Trust, what is your job exactly at the National Trust?
It's a really interesting one, actually. I've been working in heritage over in England for the last 12 years, and at the National Trust, it's an organisation that was set up about 125 years ago to preserve and protect the nation's heritage forever and for everyone. And I'm fortunate that I get to look after three beautiful historic properties. One's a moated medieval manor house called Baddesley. Another one is a sort of a Packwood, called Packwood House, and it's a sort of gentleman farmer's des res, which is rather smart with an iconic yew garden. And then famously, I also work at Coton Court, which is a property that's had associations with the gunpowder plot of 1605 fame. So my day job really is to look after them and make sure that our 600,000 visitors have a great day out, but also that I look after the maintenance and conservation and keep the roof on. So it's a really broad job, but also a really interesting one, actually.
You're looking over the history of England and of the Middle Ages, and the gunpowder plot is it's kind of come into culture here. The HBO series, I think, just called Gunpowder, about the plot, not so much on Guy Fawkes, but the plot itself leading up to it.
Yeah. And I think I think I saw that one, and actually I think the opening scene was set at allegedly set at Baddesley Clinton. So one of the properties I look after was raided by the priest hunters, and so that's one of mine. So there's lots of connections to the gunpowder plotters, and it's great that kind of history is getting told globally, because I think it's just as relevant today in our climates as it is 400 years ago.
Right. Yes. It's definitely a political climate nowadays everywhere, not just here or there. So you wrote a new book on Edward II, who's a medieval king that probably has about as much controversy as Richard III does around him. But before we get into the actual book, what kind of writing process do you follow when you go to write a book?
Well, that's the first book I've ever written, actually, and I have wanted to write it for about 23 years, believe it or not. But for me, in terms of the process, in sort of setting out on this journey, I didn't really have a manual. I didn't have a sort of a guide to tell me how to do it. So I discovered my style has kind of evolved over the years. And so what I generally do is I spend my time in libraries and archives and various different places around the country where Edward II and his court left breadcrumbs behind, if you like. And I would scribble many, many notes, copious notes, and then take them all back to my study. And over the years, those notes just became mountains of paperwork. And so then I realized, how on earth could I translate that into a book? That's something that, something could be really exciting that people could follow. And so I ended up going to my local bookstore, and I bought two plain black notebooks. I call them my Bibles. They became my Bibles in the end. And what I did is distilled all that information, that mountain of paperwork, into these two Bibles, and I went chapter by chapter. And so what I would do really with that is distill all the information over a course of a week, say if I was writing a chapter. And then what I would do with it is, once I got all the notes in there, I'd go and make a cup of tea or go running, or I don't know, go and clean the car or something. And then I would come back, sit in front of my computer screen, in front of my MacBook, and spend literally about, I don't know, 9-10 hours in a day writing a chapter. I've always been like that. I can't sort of stop, start, and do a few hundred words each day. I have to kind of really go at it in one sitting. And that seems to be how my style's evolved over the time. And it seems to hopefully has done me in good stead. So it's been a really interesting journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So you said, do you write every day in this process then?
I wish I could. I really wish I could, but no, it's probably about once a week. So when I was writing the book, I was really fortunate that I had, as I say, I'd spent years kind of thinking about writing it. And then 2 years ago, I was offered a publishing contract. And at that point, I thought, blimey, I've really got to pull my socks up. Otherwise, I'm not going to hit this deadline. So I had a really easy structure that I put in place. I knew how the book would divide up, sort of Edward's apprenticeship through to Edward and Gaveston in the first 5 years of the reign, the middle part of the reign, and then the Edward's fall from power and his relationship with Hugh Despenser the Younger. So that gave me the structure. Once I had the structure, it meant that I knew I needed to write. I was going to write chapter by chapter. So in answer to your question, I probably write one day every week where I'm actually physically, writing the words that end up in the book. And of course, that would give me the first draft. And I was really conscious as I was writing that I may have written what was about, I think, 150,000 words in the end. But when I got to the end of it, that was only the first draft. So then I really had to go back and tinker and tweak and revise and go back to all that pile of notes and just double check everything was all, I was saying the right things and also the things I wanted to say. And so, so it's a lot of sort of one day in every 7 days that I'd get my head down and really sort of write. And I'm better writing in the evening, believe it or not. So I'm not a lark. I'm an owl. I write much better in the evening. And so I start generally about 4 o'clock. I find that's a good time for me. That's when I'm sort of most awake, most alert. I've got all my ideas. I've had lots of coffee and I'm ready to go. And I would just keep writing. And of course, some chapters are easier to write. Some chapters, sometimes the ones I thought would be easy ended up being really hard. But just there's so much going on and lots of complex history and trying to find a way to tell it in a very sort of accessible way, but with all the integrity there, could mean I could be writing for 9, 10, sometimes 12 hours. So I'd literally write through the night and watch the sun come up in the morning. So that's my style. And I know everyone's a bit different, but that just seems to work for me. It's what I've kind of discovered as I've gone along.
Yeah, there's lots of advice out there on how to write or how to work, or always this the get up early kind of mentality, and it's definitely different for all people. I'm more of a night owl myself. Feel more energized at night and get a lot of work done at night. So
it definitely helps. I think I know some of my friends are very early risers, and they're writing at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and I really wish I could be like that, but it's just not my style. I just can't do it that way. So for me, it's very much the evening writing, I think.
So you'd said that you just got a publishing contract a few years ago. Did you always want to be a writer, and you just worked toward that, or was it something that just came on recently as you worked in the field, or how'd you decide to become a writer and write this book?
I mean, it's something that I think, as I say, 23 years ago, I kind of had this idea, and I think that's partly because I come from a sort of a family of bibliophiles, if you like. I've got 2 sisters and my mom and my aunts, and they're all sort of avid readers. So growing up as a child, I was always surrounded by lots of books, and I've always been a bit of a slow reader compared to my sisters. So they would be off reading like book 4, and I'd still be on book 1. But I think what that gave me was an appetite for reading, and it's nothing better than holding a book and looking at a book, and I get very excited by that. So years ago when I was a teenager, I picked up a book by an author you might know, Sharon K. Penman. She's a novelist, and she writes about medieval English history, a lot about the kings and queens of England. And she was writing a book called Here Be Dragons, and it was about the end of the days of Henry II through the reign of Richard I and then King John. And, I was absolutely hooked on this book. And I also was reading something about Edward II at the same time. And I remember thinking, gosh, wouldn't it be really great if Sharon Penman could write a book about Edward II? And then the more I thought about it, I should write to her. And I thought, actually, why should I write to it? I should actually write that book myself. And so I was determined to kind of, I suppose that's where the idea came from, that genesis of, I really wanted to write a book. And then, as I became more curious, I started to do more research, and I was really conscious that I'm not really I'm a non-fiction writer. I'm not really a novelist. So for me, I get a real buzz out of looking into people's lives who, and seeing their history, which is all real and tangible. And so I think really from that, as I got through I went to university at King's College in London and read history there. And I wrote a dissertation on Edward II. And again, I thought, this is a man I can really unpick. And I was really interested in unpicking his reign. And so in many ways, I kind of fell into it. And then 4 years ago, I really thought, I really want to make this happen now. And I really upped the research. And then about 3 years ago, I think it was New Year's Eve, and I sat there, as people do on New Year's Eve, making their resolutions and looking back over the years and thinking, I really ought to start putting pen to paper. And so did very quickly. And then once I had about, sort of 20,000 words, I thought, this is getting serious. Am I writing just for me and my mates down the pub, or am I actually writing professionally? And so I sent off my manuscripts to the first publisher. Actually, I sent it to, the only publisher was Amberley Publishing, who are based in Stroud in Gloucestershire. And Amberley are great because they really specialize in history, really broad history. But for me, I was really keen to set out the outline that I really wanted to tell Edward's story, and they were fantastic. And they got back 12 hours later and we started chatting. And then a couple of weeks later, they offered me a contract. And that, for me, set me on my professional journey. So it all kind of just fell into place, really. And their support's been fantastic. And it's together, I think we've made this happen.
Yeah, and Amberley's a great publisher for history books of all kinds. So you said that those novels from Penman, is that what sparked your interest in the Middle Ages, was reading those stories?
Yeah, certainly. I say, growing up as a child, I was always brought up on tales of knights and crusaders. So, by the age of under the age of 7, I always wanted to be Robin Hood. Who didn't want to be Robin Hood with his bow and arrows? And then after that, I was given a toy sword when I was about 7 years old for my birthday. And I remember thinking, actually, no, do you know what? I don't think I want to be Robin Hood anymore. I want to be a knight. Mm-hmm. And I became a self-proclaimed knight called Sir Stephen of the Greenfields. And that happened. I kind of played with that for a few years. And then I came across a book, which was a book about Westminster Abbey. And I remember pouring through this book, page for page for page. And I came across the coronation chair, which is still in Westminster Abbey and has been there since 1308. In fact, Edward II was the first king to be crowned on it. And it's still used by the monarch today. So Elizabeth II, of course, was the last monarch to be crowned on it. But it made me think, actually, I want to be a king. I want that top job. And whilst I never made it to king, what it did is spur me on. And so I've always been brought up, as I say, with tales of knights and, King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table and Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. And so I think medieval history has always been of real interest to me. And then as I sort of grew into my teens, I am fortunate I live in Warwickshire. So where I'm at, there's lots of medieval castles on my doorstep. And I've got family in London. So I used to go and stay for the summer in London each year during the school holidays. And my aunt took me to the Tower of London, and such a majestic building. And I think that just captured the imagination. And then when I read history at King's College in London, which is part of the University of London, whilst I read really broadly from 400 AD right through to 1925, both British and European, medieval was definitely the bit I specialised in very quickly. It's also where I got my top grades. And I think so, for me, it's always been really interesting. And the medieval period itself, what I find so fascinating about it is it may feel like it's a long time ago, but actually so much of what we live with today comes from that period. Magna Carta, which, whichever side of the pond you're on, Magna Carta's had some influence, whether it's, with the founding fathers in America or Parliament here. The development of Parliament in the 13th century, think of democracy and the rise of democracy around the free world. And of course, the majority of the legal system that we have certainly in the UK and much more widely around the world comes from this medieval period. And for me, I just think that's fascinating to think we're still living with the decisions that some of these people took our ancestors took nearly 700 years ago. And that for me is fascinating. And it's been really great to walk into places, to a local bookstore and just see how people are becoming more and more interested again in medieval history. And I think that's in part down to things like Game of Thrones. I mean, who doesn't love a bit of Game of Thrones? And so actually people are getting more and more interested. So it just feels like there's a bit of a resurgence, a bit of a renaissance with medieval history at the moment. And I really like that.
Yeah, it's great. There's the Game of Thrones here. Well, you guys probably have the Vikings as well. We have it here on the History Channel. Things like Bernard Cornwell's.
He's written quite a few different books, hasn't he? I think there's so many great writers out there who have really got on board with medieval history, whether it's factual or fiction. I think it's just inspired people, and there's something about a bit of escapism, And I think when we look back to our medieval history, there's also something, certainly for me, I get as excited now as I did when I was a kid, waving my knight sword or my Robin Hood bow and arrow. So It seems to be one of those things which is just captures the popular imagination, I think.
So you had said that you read Here Be Dragons, and you thought it'd be a good idea to write to the author and ask her to write about Edward II, and then you stopped that and you decided you were going to write. So it's been 20-some years, and you've been doing this research. Was Edward II always kind of were you always drawn to him as a person in history, or how did you become drawn to Edward, and why did you stay with him for the last 20 years and then decide to write a book on him?
Yeah, I mean, I think Edward's, there's so many kings and queens in British history. And I, again, used to sit as a child with my mom poring over the kings and queens of England. And I remember going through them all, and I used to be able to, I probably still can recite them chronologically. I remember that Edward II his reign is so chaotic. It's wedged between his infinitely more famous father, Edward I, and his infinitely more famous son, Edward III, both who were very powerful and strong and successful kings. And then Edward II's reign is just constricted to 20 years, and it's a reign which is really chaotic. And he's the first king to be deposed since the Norman conquest in 1066. And so actually, for me, there's something which it's very dramatic. There's a lot going on in that reign. And then shortly after, when I first found him in the Kings and Queens book, Mel Gibson released Braveheart. So who doesn't like a bit of Braveheart? So you actually, whilst Braveheart's not the most accurate film, it's just a great story. And I remember that Edward II appeared in that film as a prince. And I think there's one scene where his alleged boyfriend gets thrown out of the window by his really irate father, Edward I. Right. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh my God, did that really happen? I really want to know if that happened or not. And then the more I started to read about Edward, the more I kind of got drawn into his story, because he was always seen as being, a lot of strong words were thrown around. He was weak, he was incompetent. There's even words and accusations of degeneracy and all sorts of things. And I started to think back and thought, is this man who's portrayed in this really negative way, does that bad rep really stack up when you really get into the evidence? And that's, I suppose, really where my curiosity was piqued. And I've always been a curious child. I've always wanted to know things. I've always been asking lots of questions. And so I think that was the start of the journey, really. And then very quickly, I realised that no, Piers Gaveston wasn't thrown out of a window by Edward I. And also Edward, whilst he was without doubt failed in his kingship, his reign ended ignominiously, he nevertheless is a really interesting character. And there's a lot to learn in history about the people who failed at it as much as the people who were really good at it. And so I think I've always stuck with him ever since. And in fact, so much so, as I say, I wrote my dissertation in London when I was at university. And then my very first job in heritage was I was working for English Heritage before I worked for the National Trust. And there, English Heritage look after an enormous castle called Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, a really important castle. It's now a ruin. And Edward II was deposed there on the 20th of January, 1327. And that was my first job at Heritage. I really wanted to work at that castle. And so in many ways, Edward has always been in the shadows and has actually influenced my career in a strange way. So it's been sort of a very odd relationship, if you see what I mean.
You'd mentioned you kind of got your interest in Braveheart. And as inaccurate as that movie is, I think the mark of a good historical movie is that it brings out a curiosity to learn more, and then go do the studying yourself and figure out, was he thrown out the window? was this the true, depiction of the characters? So as movies are inaccurate, I think their main goal is to tell a story, but it also sparks that interest in other people to come out, and then we have a book that you wrote because of that and that interest, or at least that was part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so many people get hot under the collar when they see historical films that aren't accurate. But for me, absolutely, I agree. I think it's, if it spurs the question and the curiosity for people to go away and want to know more, then that's a really good way for people to get involved in history. And I think what I really love about history as a subject is it's really inclusive, actually, in many ways, because it doesn't matter what walk of life you come from or where you live or what you do. Actually, most people have access to a library or an internet or a bookstore. And so suddenly you can pick up a book and immerse yourself in this world which happened through your simple curiosity, and the people who are out there also trying to answer similar questions. And so both films, more broadly, and history in particular, I think are really powerful for us to, look back and feel connected to our ancestry, and so in a very inclusive way. And I think that's really powerful.
So Edward II, he inherited the kingdom after his father died. There was war with Scotland. The kingdom was in debt. They were taxing people to pay for this war. The nobility was on the verge of another rebellion. Did Edward II have a chance to be a good king, or was it just a bad start and there was no recovery from that?
I mean, I think that's one of the big questions, really. I think his inheritance was certainly toxic. I mean, in fact, the subtitle of my book is a doomed inheritance. And I think absolutely you nailed it on the head that he inherited enormous debts from his father. I think it was a tune of £200,000, which in today's money, in sterling, would be sort of multi-millions of pounds. I mean, we're talking multi-millions. And so as a result of that, he found that certainly for 15 of his 20-year reign, he was always broke. He had no money to make stuff happen. He used to have to borrow lots of money from the Pope and from Italian bankers, the Riccardi, and then they were banned. And then he borrowed money from the Bardi, and then they were banned. And then he borrowed loads more money from a chap called Antonio Pisagno. He even borrowed money from the Pope and the kings of France just to kind of square the balance books, which he never quite achieved. And that meant that he could never quite do what he needed to do. So that was always quite a challenge. And then secondly, he inherited loads of corruption in his government. So his father's ministers, people like Walter Langton, who was the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield, who'd been the treasurer, was accused even in Edward I's time of falsifying accounts and appropriating funds he shouldn't have done. And so there was certainly corruption in the government, which made Edward's purse strings even tighter, if you like. And then Edward I, his father, was also very good at levying something called prizes. Now, prizes in the medieval period is when, during times of war, when the king's raising an army, he could go out and send his men out, and they could requisition goods from the local populace. If you were lucky, you would get probably a reduced payment for them, but 9 times out of 10, you're probably not going to be paid at all for the things that these men had taken from your household. Actually, Edward I and later Edward II needed so much money that they kept doing it, both in times of war and outside of war. And so quite rightly, the population were pretty angry about that. And so there's a lot of pushback about prizes, and that's something that Edward couldn't really get around. And then, of course, there was war with Scotland. So the First Scottish War of Independence, when Alexander III, the King of Scotland, dies, and then the Maid of Norway dies, and then suddenly there's power vacuum. And Edward I appoints John Balliol to be king, and then Balliol exerts his muscles, and Edward I doesn't like that. He's not a man who's going to play second fiddle, and so removes John Balliol from the throne, and then marches into Scotland and claims to rule Scotland directly. Obviously, the Scots are not going to have any of that, and so there's this ensuing battle, this ensuing war, and Edward inherits that, a really toxic war where, even at the time of Edward I's death in July of 1307, the king at that point had not found a sustainable way to win in Scotland. And then you get the rise of Robert the Bruce, and the Bruces in particular. And Bruce is a character who is a really interesting man who sort of rises himself up unites Scotland, and then takes the fight to the English with the famous Battle of Bannockburn. And so for Edward, he inherits this war, this never-ending war. And even though Edward II is not, he loses the Battle of Bannockburn catastrophically. It's one of the biggest English defeats in English history. He nevertheless refuses to give up the fight, and I think that's because it's a bit about something about Edward's character. He's got a lot of pride, but also the country, the nation expects, they're in this campaign and they expect to win it. And so he's also caught between a rock and a hard place. And so he has to keep fighting, but doesn't really have the money to raise the troops often enough to do it. And then, of course, he has lots of internal politics at home. Edward II also inherits a lot of quite angry, agitated nobles who, at the time of his father's reign, had been chomping at the bit for reforms to the government. And Edward I is famous for quite often, refusing reform, or if he's forced and backed into a corner, he accepts it and then rescinds it later. He tries to overturn all of those reforms, so he holds them back. And when Edward II comes to the throne, he inherits that. But I think what people sometimes forget is Edward II, saw how his father reigned, and so inherited in very much the same way his father's views that he should also hold back baronial reforms. Because often those reforms encroached on the crown and encroached on the royal sovereignty of the crown. And that meant for Edward, all the way through his reign, he was fiercely protective of his rights over the crown. And so he would often he would fight his nobles. And so he would hold back reform too, which meant that ultimately it all just got very messy in Edward's reign, actually. So, by the time he becomes king, he's got a war on the go, he's got no money, he's got corrupt ministers, he's got overmighty vassals, his nobles who are chomping at the bit for reform. You've got the Bruce brothers getting really powerful in Scotland. He's loaning money left, right and centre to keep the government afloat. It's going to be a pretty tough job, and you're going to have to be a pretty tough character to try and balance and square all of that. And just if that wasn't enough, then there's a huge, a really entrenched, deep European famine that sweeps across Western Europe. And it lands in England in 1315 and is there pretty much for 3 successive years, and then comes back in the early 1320s, and it just wipes out, I think, something like 1/10 of the population, and really weakens people's resolve. And again, it just means there's less taxation, less money, and so it just all gets very messy. And then, of course, there's the royal favourites, so people like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer the Younger, which just makes it all very complicated.
If people only have a basic understanding or basic knowledge of Edward II, I think they kind of equate him to his favorites, and that's kind of what's always talked about. But it sounds like he had a hard go of it no matter what, with everything that was going on in the country. So did his favorite, the first of his favorites, I guess, was Piers Gaveston, and was he like a close advisor? He was obviously a close friend, possibly more. Was he giving him good advice, bad advice? Did Edward look to him for advice?
I mean, Piers Gaveston is one of those really kind of controversial figures that comes out of history as being just that, really controversial. Gaveston and Edward met each other when they were teenagers. In fact, Gaveston's father, Arnaud, used to fight for Edward I. And when he came over from France, he settled with he brought 3 of his sons with him in 1300. And we think that Piers Gaveston, who was a teenager at that point, was already really good at military arms. And so Edward I thought he was a great guy to go and put into the household of his son, Edward. And so the 2 boys are put together, and they have quite a lot in common. They lost their mothers. Both of them lost their mothers when they were particularly young. Their fathers are away off in a war. They're both interested in theatre and theatrical displays, and they're quite witty and sarcastic. And so you can see this kind of relationship that builds. And I think actually as the years grow on, I think that friendship spills over probably into something a bit more intimate. And so by the time Edward II becomes king, I'm quite certain, looking at the evidence, that Gaveston and Edward II were lovers, in fact. And so when Edward comes to the throne, he tries to raise Gaveston in status, because Gaveston, whilst he's not, is sometimes accused of being raised from the dust. Gaveston was actually, his family were from Gascony, and in Gascony they were relatively high up in the noble hierarchy, if you like. But they, in England, Gaveston was still far below the rank of Earl, and very quickly Edward raised him up to become the Earl of Cornwall within a month of his accession, in fact. And initially, the nobles support it, and they think, "Oh, that's absolutely fine." But then, very quickly, Gaveston is then married off to Margaret de Clare, who's one of the big marriage catches of the day. She's the sister of the Earl of Gloucester, and then there's a great big tournament held at Wallingford in the December of 1307, and Gaveston is able to outmaneuver and trump all of the established earls in the tournament, which of course dents their pride. And then very quickly, Gaveston also becomes the regent of England. So when Edward II heads off to marry Isabella of France, who's the daughter of the King of France, in the January 1308, he leaves behind Gaveston to run the kingdom for the 2 or 3 weeks that Edward is away. Now, ordinarily, that position would have gone to a senior earl, probably an earl with royal blood, so like Thomas of Lancaster or Henry of Lancaster, who was Edward's cousins. But instead, Edward gives that to Gaveston, and that upsets the nobility. And then the straw that breaks the camel's back really is when then in the coronation a few months later, when Edward's crowned at Westminster Abbey, there's what you do and what roles you're given is really important. In the medieval world, which is really hierarchical and full of precedents, who carries the crown of St. Edward the Confessor is the top job in terms of the coronation service. And so Edward allows Gaveston to not only carry that crown in front of all the other people who are assembled, which gives Gaveston precedence over all of the nobility, but Gaveston also rocks up wearing purple, which is a colour reserved only for the monarch. And so it sends out a really clear signal. And I think for the nobility at the time, they're really upset with Gaveston, less so because because he's in an intimate relationship with the king. That's not particularly the issue. I think it's more that whilst they weren't probably happy with it, it wasn't enough for opposition. I think what drove the nobles into opposition to Piers Gaveston was that Gaveston was thought to or perceived to be too close to the king's patronage. Now, in an age where the king ruled and not reigned and was the centre of government, handing out gifts of land and title meant creative power. And so Gaveston, who was the recipient of a lot of that patronage, in many ways drove that patronage away from the traditional earls and barons of the kingdom. And so they were really quite uncomfortable with it. They felt that they were losing power and influence, which was their traditional rights. And so Gaveston had to go. And in fact, the next 3 years, they spent quite a lot of time trying to, I think Gaveston's exiled 3 times from 1307 until 1311. He returns at the beginning of 1312. And in the end, the only way to get rid of Gaveston is to murder him. And so that's quite brutal, really.
So the nobles took it into their own hands to get rid of the favorites so that...
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think and it shocked contemporaries at the time. So it was led by the king's cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, and the Earl of Warwick, Guy de Beauchamp. And when Gaveston returned, Edward brought him back in the sort of January of 1312, despite the ordinances, which is a set of legislation that was published the year before, and in Clause 20 had to enforce Gaveston's exile. Edward simply overturned the ordinances, and so Gaveston is brought back, and the nobility, who are enormously angered by Gaveston's return, means that they're not going to suffer any falls. And so Gaveston and Edward head up north to northern England and base themselves up there. And the idea is they're going to hold out against what is inevitably going to be a number of leading nobles who are going to come up and try and seize Gaveston. In the end, they do seize him. So Gaveston is cornered at Scarborough Castle, whilst Edward is hunkered down at York. And Gaveston is agrees to surrender Scarborough Castle in terms for lenient terms, where he can then be taken south to Wallingford Castle, which was Gaveston's castle. And then he could go to Parliament, and in front of his peers, as the law dictated, he could then be tried by his peers. And the most likely outcome of that was either Gaveston would be exiled once again, or at worst imprisoned. However, that all went wrong. So when the Earl of Pembroke, who was responsible for taking Gaveston south, they got as far as Deddington in Oxfordshire. And Pembroke that evening, his wife, Pembroke's wife was staying in one of their local manors, and Pembroke went off to go and spend the night with his wife. And whilst he was away, Gaveston was left with a very light guard at Deddington. And the Earl of Warwick, who had never particularly been fond of Gaveston at all, in fact, rocked up with a few hundred men and seized Gaveston, took him back to Warwick Castle, and waited for Lancaster and the Earl of Hereford and a few others to assemble. And there Gaveston had a mock trial where he was accused of evil counsel with the king and of overexerting himself and gaining all of this wealth and power. And so they sentenced him to death. Now, the nobles at the time were acting well beyond their jurisdiction, because the ordinances, which they claimed was their legal footing in which to execute Gaveston, had in fact already been overturned by the king, and the nobles knew that. But nevertheless, Gaveston was sentenced to death, and he was dragged out of the castle, taken a few miles beyond Warwick to a place called Blacklow Hill, between Warwick and Kenilworth Castle, not far from where I used to live, actually. And then at the top of the hill, he was handed over to two Welshmen, and there one ran him through the stomach. And as he was there, then crouched down and dying, the other chopped off his head. And so that was the end of Piers Gaveston in June of 1312. But what was really shocking is that sometimes I think we look back at the medieval period and we think, well, the medieval period was a bit brutal. That's probably what they did all the time. But actually, they didn't do that all the time. And there's only, I think, about 3 or 4 earls who had been executed since 1066, right up until 1312. And in all of those occasions, that had been with the king's permission, directly or indirectly. But this was something completely different. This was a group of earls who had, despite the king's protestations and need to protect Gaveston, wrestled him from the king, taken him south, and then executed him and murdered him. And so for Edward, this is a game changer in 1312, and a game changer for British history, because suddenly this changed the rules of the chessboard, if you like. And so for Edward, he then spent 10 years desperately trying to get revenge on the murderers of his lover, Piers Gaveston.
And was there any backlash on them? Did he get his revenge? Did he strip them of their titles or execute them? Or
I think he was desperate to do that from the start, but unfortunately, there were so many of the nobility at the time who agreed with Gaveston's fall from power, even though some supported the king. There were not quite enough between them to quite outmaneuver one or the other. So the king was never strong enough in those early years to bring about his vengeance on people like Thomas of Lancaster, who took responsibility for Gaveston's murder. And so what happens is this stalemate. There's a stalemate which is created in England. So there's a fragile peace which is agreed in 1313. And then for the next 10 years, up until 1322, Edward II spends most of his time trying to outmaneuver people like his cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. And as a consequence, government sort of grinds to a halt, and then the famine arrives, and government gets really quite difficult. Lancaster is also a difficult character. He's quite stubborn. He's pompous. He's quite even his own the earls, his own peers, find him hard to work with. And eventually, it isn't until 1321 when the rise of the Hugh Despencer the Younger causes real politics in England. And so Hugh Despencer goes on a bit of a land grab, which means that then the nobles react, or certainly the ones in the Welsh March. They head to Thomas of Lancaster for help. Lancaster's not sure whether to help or not. But cutting a long story short, in the end, these contrarian rebels, as they become known, oppose the king. Edward, by 1322, the start of 1322, actually becomes really quite in a position of strength. He sends his wife, Isabella of France, the Queen, to Leeds Castle, which is held by one of the rebels, Bartholomew Badlesmere, who used to be one of Edward II's close advisors, who turned himself over to the rebels. And actually there, Isabella tried to gain entry to the castle, and Badlesmere's wife refused to let her in, and fighting ensued in which 6 of her men were killed, and Isabella narrowly escapes with her life. And actually what that does, and what in many ways was probably planned by Edward and Isabella, it creates sympathy and pity for both Isabella and the king. And so there's a huge following of people who support the king, who then heads into the west and sweeps through the West Country and up through Wales. And suddenly all these contrarian rebels fall apart. Their opposition falls apart, and then he's able to round on Lancaster. And eventually Lancaster is cornered at Borough Bridge, at the Battle of Borough Bridge, by Sir Andrew Harclay. And Lancaster's supporter, Edward's brother-in-law, the Earl of Hereford, is killed on the bridge. So he's actually skewered up from underneath by a pikeman as he's crossing the bridge, which is a very gruesome way to go. And then Lancaster is brought before the king at Pontefract, which is Lancaster's own castle. And there, much in the same way as Gaveston's trial had been, Lancaster wasn't afforded a trial in Parliament by his peers. In fact, he was adjudged by the king and a few of the earls in a private trial at Pontefract. And there he was then, like Gaveston, taken out of the castle, like Gaveston, taken to a local hill, and like Gaveston, he was beheaded. But in Lancaster's execution, it took 3 strokes of the sword to sever his head from his neck. And for Edward, that was his finest hour in many ways in his reign. He'd actually got his vengeance. He'd actually got everything that he had wanted. And if anything, it became more powerful than he'd had through the first 15 years of his reign. But inadvertently, what Edward II had done had also changed the game, the chessboard rules, if you like. Because up until that point, if anybody disagreed with the monarch or what the king was doing or perceived to be doing, they had the right to rebel. They may not always come out on top if they had rebelled, and quite often they didn't, but they had that right. What Edward II did by executing his cousin in 1322 was to say, well, actually, if you stand against me now as your king, don't expect exile or imprisonment like you would have had in the past. What you will have now is you'll pay the ultimate price. And it changes the rules. And so actually, if you're going to oppose Edward II after 1322, you've got to be prepared to lose everything: your family, your life, your home, your lands, your title, your power. So it's a game of all or nothing. And equally, if you're going to win, the only way you're really going to win is either to imprison or to depose a king. So it really changes politics.
Yeah, it's in a pretty clear, cut and dry message. There's only one way to do it, and that's to kill the other person, I guess.
Absolutely.
So you'd mentioned the rise of Hugh Despencer, and after Piers, Hugh Despencer became Edward's favorite at some point in his reign. Did he either not learn from the Piers-Gaveston situation, or did he just feel that he needed another favorite, another advisor that was close to him to help with all these other nobles that weren't quite on the same page as he was?
I think certainly the rise of Hugh Despencer the Younger is the final turning point in the Edward II story. Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer the Younger are also quite different characters. I think for Gaveston and Edward, who had been very close together, brought up together as teenagers, had become lovers. For them, for Gaveston was about trying to rise in status, but not necessarily political power. Gaveston wasn't interested in the government particularly, and so he would never encroach upon the royal sovereignty. Hugh Despencer the Younger had been at court since 1306, so round about even before Edward II became king. But it wasn't until about 1319 that Hugh Despencer the Younger suddenly starts to gain position at court. And a few years earlier, he becomes quite wealthy, inherits 1/3 of the earldom of Gloucester, doesn't become Earl of Gloucester, but inherits the land. By 1319, he becomes the Chamberlain of Edward's household, which is a really important position because the Chamberlain controls access to the king. It doesn't matter who you are, you have to go through the Chamberlain to get to the king. And Despencer, unlike Gaveston, uses that office in a really particular way. So he uses it to its fullest. Now, Hugh Despencer the Younger is really interested in power. In fact, I would go so far as to say, looking at the evidence, that Despencer is volatile and rapacious, and he tries to exploit that position in order to gain control of Edward, gain control of the sort of machinery of government, if you like, and tries to dominate at court. And so very quickly he becomes this real threatening presence at court. And I think historians have often seen Edward II as, sort of falling madly in love with Hugh Despencer, and he becomes infatuated with him. One of the questions I certainly raised in my book was actually, why was Edward suddenly infatuated with Hugh Despencer the Younger at all? Because he'd known him for 20 odd years, and in 20 years he'd never really paid him much attention. And I think really that was because Hugh Despenser the Younger was such in many ways a nasty piece of work that Edward thought, here's a man who could really help me overcome my cousin Thomas Earl of Lancaster, who wasn't executed until a few years after the rise of Hugh Despenser the Younger. And so I think Edward looked to Hugh as a man who could help him. And he also looked at him and thought, here's a king that can really help me, actually. And Hugh Despenser the Younger is quite famous as being incredibly clever and calculating and manipulative. And I think he started to really manipulate Edward. And in fact, when you look at Edward's character and you look at Edward the man rather than just the king, you see that his infatuation with Hugh Despenser is probably driven by not just by his desire for Despenser, but also for his need. And I think for Despenser, it's very much about power. And so Despenser sort of dominates Edward very, very quickly. And that's out of character for the king. So he had favourites in the middle part of his reign called Roger de Moray, Hugh Audley and William Montacute. Again, men that Edward had raised up. But even with Gaveston and those middle favourites, Edward had never been dominated by them. And it may seem odd to some to suggest, but it seems likely that Hugh Despenser was something of an emotional manipulator, that he was able to manipulate Edward in such an emotional way that the king very quickly started to isolate himself from the members of his court. You can see in the chronicles, I think, how Despenser is accused of answering for the king in the king's presence and not allowing the king to speak. And this really, it worries the nobles enormously, more so because Hugh Despenser the Younger is so ambitious. He goes on a land grab and so starts grabbing lots of land in the Welsh March in Wales and disinherits people. And the king kind of lets this happen. And so what happens is you get rebellion, which sees Thomas of Lancaster, who's then executed. And after Lancaster's fall, the Despensers temporarily are exiled just before Lancaster loses his head. They return, and when they return, the Despensers, both father and son, who are also both called Hugh, I think they're out for vengeance themselves. They're really upset that they've lost their positions at court. And when they come back, they gain the king's control again. And then for the next few years, the reign of Edward II towards the end is often seen as something of a tyranny. And there's certainly some truth in that, because during those last few years of Edward's reign, Despenser dominates the court. And I think Isabella, Edward's wife, and he alienates, actually. And Isabella and Edward had a very successful marriage for the first 15 years of their time together. I think whilst Edward may have had a propensity for male lovers, he was bisexual. He also had 4 children. And so what happens is that marriage starts to break down. And when Isabella leaves England, she goes on a diplomatic mission to France. I think at that point, both Edward and Hugh Despenser did not realise or appreciate just how disgruntled the Queen was, and also members of the government, the earls and nobles and barons of England, who were afraid of Despenser's hold over the king. And they were afraid for their own lands. They thought that Despenser would come for them and that they would be powerless to stop them, because if the king wasn't going to prevent it, nobody could. And so I think that was reason why, in many ways, Hugh Despenser was in part, or certainly one of the main reasons for the fall of Edward II a few years later.
I find that interesting that they had a successful marriage for the first part of their marriage. I was always under the impression that, I've given into the pop culture or whatever, that they didn't have a very good relationship at all.
Yeah, I think that's really a sort of like you say, that is part of the pop culture, really. I think that when you look at the evidence, it's very easy to think that because Edward II had male favourites, that he somehow wasn't interested in his wife. And actually, there was 11 years that separated them in age. So when they married in February of 1308, Isabella was 12 and Edward was 23. And so it was a marriage of politics. It wasn't a love marriage, as so many of these marriages were in the medieval period. But what we certainly find is that even though Gaveston dominated the first 5 years of Edward's life and occupied his reign, Gaveston, Isabella, and Gaveston's wife, Margaret, actually are seen in each other's company a lot. And in fact, when Gaveston is exiled on the third time, Isabella sends money to Gaveston to help ease his position in exile. It would all too easy to run away with the assumption that Isabella was and Edward's marriage failed from the start. It certainly didn't. And then as Isabella herself matured and was able to bear children, they had 4 children together, Edward Edward was the eldest, who became Edward III, and he was born in 1312, the year that Gaveston was murdered. And then there was John, who was the second son, who became the Earl of Cornwall, John of Eltham. And then Eleanor, who was named after Eleanor of Castile, who was Edward's mother. And then the last child, Joan, who was born in 1321 in the Tower, was named after Isabella's mother, Joan of Navarre. Those four children are in many ways proof that the marriage worked. And as we also look through the evidence, and that Isabella herself still had all the traditional roles expected of a queen. So one of the principal roles of queenship was something called intercession. So it's a more formal political role where the queen could act as a conduit to her husband. It was another way of presenting petitions and arguments to her husband on behalf of others, but also that in times of crisis, if the king was forced into a political situation that he couldn't back down on, the queen could kneel in front of her husband and beg the king to back down, and so the king could back down without losing face. And that actually happened at the Westminster Parliament in 1321, when the nobles were chomping at the bit for the exile of the Despensers. Edward had refused, and eventually Isabella went into the chamber, knelt in front of him, and pleaded for Edward to exile them. And so right up until that point, Isabella and Edward's relationship certainly seems to be intimate, and it also seems to work politically. It wasn't until the rise of Hugh Despenser, who really then began to dominate after the fall of Thomas of Lancaster in 1322, that marriage somehow cools really rapidly, really, really quickly. And I think that's Isabella is a victim, like so many of the nobles, of Despenser's rapacity as he isolates the king. And I think Isabella is so disgusted by Despenser's control over the king that she tries to break that spell. And so, in fact, when she's over in France on a diplomatic mission trying to restore the Gascony, which is part of the Dukedom of Aquitaine, to England, which had been confiscated by her brother, Charles IV, Isabella, when all that's concluded successfully, and Isabella does that successfully on behalf of the English crown, what happens then is Isabella stands up in front of the court. Edward is expecting her to return because the job has been done, and Isabella refuses. And in fact, not only does she refuse publicly in front of the court, but she declares that she won't return until an impostor who is come between herself and her king, her husband, is removed from court. And she never says Hugh Despenser the Younger, but it's really obvious to everybody who this is. And suddenly that kind of dirty laundry of the marriage is being aired in front of the whole of Europe. And it's incredibly embarrassing for Edward, and it's embarrassing for Isabella. And from there on in, that marriage really does just rapidly fall apart, which eventually leads to the invasion that Isabella heads up.
Yeah, and that makes it even more intriguing if they had a successful marriage, even if it was only partially successful. You have all these nobles who are, I guess, disgruntled with Edward, but his downfall and his getting deposed from the throne is led by his own wife.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's because Isabella and the nobility at the time think that they've got to remove Despenser. And there's always this really fine line between when did the invasion, which arrived in England, headed by Isabella and Roger Mortimer in 1326, was that really just about deposing the Despensers initially, or was it always about deposing Edward II? And I think it's really difficult to determine whether, for Isabella, whether it was the deposition of her husband or not. I think what complicated it for Isabella was, whilst there's no really clear evidence that Isabella and Roger Mortimer were lovers, in my view, I think looking at their actions and looking how they behaved after 1326, they most certainly were lovers. But Isabella, when she arrived in England and landed a force of, I think, 132 ships and 8 warships at Orwell in Suffolk, actually, when you rock up with that kind of army to say that you're going to depose your husband, wouldn't have won Isabella any support. And so she was very clear that when she landed, it was about removing Hugh Despenser, both Despensers, the elder, the father, and the younger, the one at court. And so as Isabella travels from east to west across England, the English nobility, who was so worried about their own positions because of the power of Despenser and Edward's tyranny in his government, that they flee to Isabella's side. And it's all about the removal of the Despensers, which she achieves in November of 1326. And Despenser the Elder is captured at Bristol, and he can't hold the castle, and so he's dragged out and he's promptly hung, drawn, and quartered. And then Hugh Despenser the Younger, who's caught with Edward in Wales in Llantrysant in the middle of November, he's then taken to Hereford along with the Earl of Arundel and a few others. And there, Hugh Despenser the Younger is taken from the gallows, put up on a 50-foot ladder, where he's drawn through the streets of Hereford up this 50-foot ladder. Then his intestines are pulled out, his genitals are cut off and burnt in front of him. And then eventually he's beheaded and dismembered. And the Queen is watching this. So for Isabella, it feels very personal. And actually the way these people are executed is a very, very personal strike back. And so I think that's very, it's a real testament to that failed relationship. And the Earl of Arundel, in fact, I think he's executed the day after, I think, and he takes something like 22 blows of a blunt sword to sever his head. So gruesome is his execution. Yeah. It's very gruesome, isn't it? And so I think that for Isabella and for Roger Mortimer, it becomes very personal. But by that point, they are most certainly having an intimate relationship. And so if at that moment you were to put Edward II back on the throne, it left a really awkward conundrum for all these people who A, had either invaded, or B, had run over to Isabella's side. What would you do? Would you put the king, would you just release him from his prison and say, there you go back to ruling, but here's some constraints on you? Or would they, knowing that Edward II, after Gaveston had been murdered, spent 10 years stewing for vengeance and achieved it, that had they let him have his freedom, he would have come after them one by one, slowly but surely, and removed them and executed them. So I think suddenly, even though they had removed successfully the Despensers and the people who had badly influenced Edward at court, suddenly there was no other option for them. And so Edward II had to go, because he had a son, he had two sons at that point, and so there was heirs to the throne. And so they were really forced into this unprecedented option of deposing a king. And there was no rules set on about how to do it. They had to kind of invent it. The kind of the smoke and mirrors I talk about in my book. So Isabella and Mortimer had to create a real theatre around this deposition. And actually, it's very easy to run away with the popular view that even at that moment in the December of 1326, when Edward was imprisoned and the Despensers were dead, that everybody was against Despenser. And actually, that's not true. So when Parliament met, or a body which claimed to be Parliament, met in January of 1327, Isabella and Mortimer thought they would immediately move to deposition and it'd be really simple. And actually, Parliament were really divided about it. They were really uncomfortable about removing an anointed king who had gone through a coronation, who had spiritually been, risen up with the anointing above them in an age which was very spiritual and superstitious and religious. And so Parliament had to be bullied to conclude that deposition was the only, or abdication was the only possible means. And so even then they were really uncomfortable about it. So a delegation was sent off to Kenilworth, and I think it was the Bishop of Lincoln and Winchester who met the king first in his private chambers, and Edward knew this was coming, and they pleaded with him to step down, and Edward quite rightly refused. He'd been anointed, he didn't see the justice in being removed, even though he'd been threatened with it in the past. And he fought bitterly, and then he was met with a delegation of all the representatives, so knights, earls, barons, barons of the Cinque Ports, all that kind of thing, and eventually was bullied into giving up his crown, which he did reluctantly on the 20th of January, 1327. And that's a date really that should be marked in history. It should be in many ways as famous as 1066 or 1215 and Magna Carta, but for some reason it isn't. And from that moment, Edward loses his throne. But even then, after he loses in the January, there are 3 attempts to rescue him from his imprisonment, both at Kenilworth and at Berkeley Castle that year. And there are attempts to restore him to the throne. And even after his alleged murder in September of 1327, people were still convinced he was alive and were still determined to rescue him. So it's very easy to run away with the myth that Edward II was really unpopular at the time of his fall. Actually, yes, he was in some circles, but also in many others, he was loved, and they wanted him back.
Sure, and you'd have those loyalists who, like you said, try to free him from his imprisonment and try to restore him to the throne. So then you have the big question, even when he is in prison, what do you do with an ex-king? So what do you think? You wrote your book, and as historians, it's kind of our job to be more objective and just lay the facts out there. But what's your opinion on Edward's fate? Was he murdered? Did he die of natural causes, or just was he sent off into exile and told never to come back?
I think that's become the biggest and most curious of questions, hasn't it, really? I think certainly, what I try to do in my book is present all the facts and for people to form their own view. My personal opinion, which I make clear in the book, is that I certainly don't believe that Edward II was murdered with a red-hot poker, which is one of the things that most people seem to know. If they know anything about Edward II, it's a good old red-hot poker story. The red-hot poker is definitely a myth. It's one of those stories that was put about 30 years or so after Edward II was allegedly murdered by people, chroniclers like Geoffrey Le Baker, who was writing at a time when there was a move to canonize Edward II, to make him into a saint. And so this notion of a king being put to death, being bungered to death with a red-hot poker in dark corners of Gloucestershire, in many ways played to that symbolism of a body in the medieval period that was seen to be purified from sin by fire. So I think it's also a very it's a very challenging way to go. And in fact, I have here the chronicler, the Brute, actually, that writes, this is what they write about this particular moment. This is where the red hot poker story really gets going. So the Brute states, after dinner, when the king had gone to bed and was asleep, the traitors went quietly to his chamber and laid a large table on his stomach, and with other men's help pressed him down. The tyrants, the false tyrants, then took a horn and put it in his fundament as deep as they could go, and took a spit of burning copper and put it through the horn into his body, and oftentimes rolled it there within his bowels. So they killed their lord, and nothing was perceived. All very gruesome medieval stuff. But it's also not the most convenient way to murder a king. It also feels like a lot of effort. Right. So if Edward II was murdered, he was most likely murdered very conveniently and quietly by suffocation. So it would seem likely that whilst the king was sleeping, he was probably suffocated with a pillow or something similar on or around the 21st of September 1327. And that really is where, for 650 years, the story has kind of stopped. That's always been the assumption of Edward's fate. And then something strange happened. So in 1878, someone called Alexander Germain, who was an archivist working in Montpellier, discovered a really extraordinary letter written in 1336, so 9 years after Edward II was allegedly murdered. And this letter was written by a man called Manuele Fieschi, who was living in northern Italy, around the Genoa region. And in it, he was writing to Edward III. And in this letter, he had claimed to recently, in 1336, to have met a man who was purporting to be Edward II. And what Manuele did in the letter was write out the confession that this man, supposedly Edward II, had said to Manuele. And in this letter, the confession, it goes into great detail about, it starts with the fall, the invasion of Isabella and the fall of Edward II. And then the assumption that actually he survived. He was tipped off about his murder, the people who were coming to murder him in September. He was subsequently escaped to Corfe Castle, where he was held at Corfe, and then for a few years. And then he was carted off to Ireland. And then suddenly his keeper, who had been with him for all this time, disappears in the letter. And Edward's suddenly free around 1330. And then, according to the letter, he then travels secretly down to Avignon in France, where the Pope is residing. And the Pope entertains him for a few weeks, convinces him not to fight for his throne, because at this point, Edward III is setting up his own kingship, and England is starting to move into a period of stability. And in fact, to head off over to Italy and to reside in Italy and live out his days as a hermit. And this letter, whilst it all sounds very fanciful, actually has some extraordinary details in it. And we know, first and foremost, the letter's not a forgery. We know it dates to the period, and that the handwriting and all that kind of thing matches what it should match. So the letter's not forged. We also know that some of the things in the letters are extraordinary. So things like when Edward II was fleeing west, when Isabella was invading, one of the things he did with a very, very small group of people was to take a ship he would try to head to Ireland, we think, and sailed from Chepstow. which is a really unlikely port. It's a big, beautiful castle at Chepstow that was only out a few months ago. But Chepstow is this tiny, tiny little port. Most people would have thought he would have sailed from Bristol or elsewhere, but he didn't. And the only reason we know he sailed from Chepstow today is because one of the handful of people who were with him at the time wrote it down in his chamber accounts, which are now with the London Society of Antiquaries. In this letter is the fact it states that Edward sailed from Chepstow. Well, actually, nobody, certainly in Genoa, would have known that. And very few people in England at the time knew the king sailed from Chepstow. So it's absolutely extraordinary. And there's lots of these little details in this letter which start to add veracity to its authenticity. It makes it feel that actually this letter there's something more going on here than some simple imposter. Then on top of that, there's lots of other things. Edward III certainly believed that once he received the letter, that the content was either accurate or he believed enough to investigate. And so, interestingly, he immediately pays off a debt to the ruling families of Genoa for piracy. So in 1321, casting our dates back, when Hugh Despenser the Younger was exiled temporarily after the Westminster Parliament, he turned pirate. On one of the ships that he had commandeered was a Genoese ship. And for years, the Genoese had been asking for compensation. And for years, the English had refused to pay it. And then suddenly, after the Emanuele's letter arrives, Edward III pays it off. Now, Edward II is supposedly a hermit or at a monastery in Genoa. On top of that, Edward III then goes on to people like Thomas Berkeley, who's responsible, is the owner of the castle, Berkeley Castle, where Edward II is supposed to have been murdered, is acquitted at the next Parliament. He's let off. And then other things start to happen. So it just gets very odd. And Isabella of France, who had been, Edward III had kept Isabella in close confinement after the fall of Roger Mortimer in 1330. Isabella has a lot of her land stripped, not all, but most. After the Emanuele letter arrives, the Fieschi letter, he increases her income. He starts to give his mother more money, I presume, that he thinks that his mother wasn't actually complicit in his father's murder at all. And so there's lots of things, there's lots of circumstantial evidence which floats around. There's two other really big pieces of evidence. One is 6 years before the letter arrived in England, in 1330, 3 years after Edward II was supposedly dead, his half-brother, Edmund, Earl of Kent, believes that his brother is alive. And he believes that he's being held in Corfe Castle, which, of course, Emanuele later writes in his letter, which Emanuele would have been aware of. And that Kent, not only is he convinced that his brother is alive, he tries to put together a plot to rescue him. And he convinces at least 40, if not more, leading people of the day, surreptitiously and quietly, behind Isabella and Roger Mortimer's back, who were governing the country, that Edward II is alive. And these people include the Archbishop of York and the Mayor of London and others. In the end, the plot fails. It's foiled by Isabella and Mortimer. And so if the king was at Corfe, he suddenly disappears again back into the shadows. Interestingly, out of the 40 people who were there to spring him from Corfe, included the person, John Pesce, who used to be the custodian of Corfe Castle. We don't know quite when he lost his position there, but he may have seen Edward II arrive in secret captivity by Roger Mortimer and Isabella, after Edward II was supposedly murdered. Just before the letter arrives, when Roger Mortimer falls from power in 1330 and is accused of the murder of Edward II, he's then sent to Tyburn and is executed. The following day in Parliament, after Mortimer is accused of treason, Thomas Berkeley, the man who was later acquitted after the Fieschi letter arrives, Thomas Berkeley's asked about the murder of Edward II, and Berkeley says something really extraordinary in 1330. He says to all of Parliament, I'm not complicit in the murder of Edward II, and in fact, not only am I not complicit, I didn't even know Edward II was dead until this very moment you've told me in Parliament, which is extraordinary because Thomas Berkeley had apparently attended the funeral of Edward II in 1327, and so lots of these pieces of evidence are floating around. And I think it's very easy for us to think that we can fall into a trap, I think, as historians sometimes, of thinking that we know what the past looked like. And so what I've tried to do in this book, and what other people have done since, like Ian Mortimer and Catherine Warner, is to step back and start with a blank canvas and take all these pieces of circumstantial evidence and put them side by side, and to see what does that actually tell us, if anything. And I think when you do that, the traditional narrative that Edward II was murdered doesn't look as anywhere near as compelling now as the idea and the notion that he survived. We've got some really good pieces of evidence. Yes, they may be all circumstantial, but like any historian's a bit like a CSI crime fighter. You kind of have to take each individual piece on its merit. And I think when you do that and you block out what you think you know, it's a really compelling story. And the last compelling piece of the jigsaw for me, which in my mind convinces me that Edward II survived, is not only all of that evidence, but in 1338, we think that Edward III, in fact, met his father in Cologne in Germany, what is now modern-day Germany. And in the king's records, there is something that states that in 1338, a man is arrested in Lombardy, a man called William Legales, or William the Welshman, and he's taken from Koblenz, where he's arrested, and then taken down to Cologne, where Edward III is waiting. And this man in Edward III's account is described as being a man calling himself as the king's father. Now, in the medieval period, an imposter claiming to be a king or a former king or whatever would most likely have either been imprisoned very promptly or in most cases executed. And in fact, there had been imposters during the reign of Edward II, and he had done just that. Edward III defies convention. He doesn't do any of that with this William the Welshman. In fact, he entertains him at his own expense for 2 weeks. At the same time that Edward III's wife has just given birth to her second son, Lionel, which would be Edward II's grandson. And it would appear that William the Welshman may well have been introduced to Lionel and others. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, is not rounded up, is not imprisoned or executed. He's just simply left to go and head back to Lombardy. And interestingly, when he was arrested in Koblenz, he was supposed to be arrested by a Lombard who was his companion. Lombardy is the area in which Genoa sits. So this man, this William the Welshman, came from Genoa, where we think Edward II was in fact residing. So again, lots of circumstantial evidence. And Legales or Legales means the Welshman, and Edward II was born in Wales, born at Carnarvon Castle in April of 1284. So it would be a very fitting pseudonym to suggest that it was in fact Edward II. We may never know, of course. We may never find any more evidence that would suggest that. But it's incredibly compelling stuff. And it all sounds very fanciful and conspiracy-like. And, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I work in the world of facts. I always have as a historian. And so for me, I take each piece of evidence with a pinch of salt, and there's a lot of analysis around it. But even when I weigh up if you get a balanced scale, and you look at the evidence for murder and you look at the evidence of survival at the moment is tipping the balance for me. And so I'm quite clear in my book that my personal view is that Edward II did in fact survive.
There's definitely intriguing facts to lean that way, that's for sure. It would be interesting with all the science that's been evolving today. We saw it kind of with the discovery of Richard III, if they could examine the body, or is there a body that they had buried at some point when they had said Edward had died, if they could examine that and see if it actually is him.
I mean, it would be really interesting, wouldn't it? So the funeral of Edward II, the alleged, if it was Edward II, the funeral in December of 1327 at what is now Gloucester Cathedral. Interesting, when the body or the coffin was interred, there was a plain black marble slab put on over the coffin. And that was that. And then, interesting, when you look through the records, in 1341, Edward sends money to Nicolinus de Fieschi, who is related to Manueli, on a mission to Genoa. And he pays his expenses every day and we don't know for what, it's all very cloak and dagger, for a few months. And what that may well be is Nicolinus being sent to Genoa to return the body of Edward II, who may have died in and around 1341. And if that is the case, there would be some strong evidence to suggest that the body was then brought back and interred at Gloucester Cathedral at that point. Because shortly after 1341, but not before this money was sent over to Genoa, Edward III then commissions a really beautiful, elaborate tomb made of perfect marble and other sorts of marble, which becomes Edward II's tomb. And only after the 1341 do members of the royal family start going on pilgrimage to Edward II's grave at Gloucester, but never before. And so even in death, it may well be that the body of the king was interred very quietly at a later date. And again, circumstantial evidence, but it may be that the royal family knew that and didn't visit the tomb until after that date, because they knew after 1341 it was in fact their Edward II, their father, their uncle, or whichever, buried beneath the stones at Gloucester.
More points to ponder on his actual fate. That's interesting. So Edward II, The Man, A Doomed Inheritance. It's a great book. Do you have plans for another book?
I think I've certainly got the writing bug. I think it's contagious, actually. So for me, I'm fascinated by the 14th century. In fact, I run a blog called 14thcenturyfiend.com. And I think one of the things I'm really interested in is looking back at the first wars of Scottish independence. So looking at the rise of Robert the Bruce, and because he's a man who's born to a long line of earls, the Earls of Carrick, who is an outsider and actually ends up as King of Scotland, and not easily either. And then he spends the first few years desperately trying to hold on to his gains, and then he's got to fight the English, and he fights Edward III and Edward II, and then even Edward III to some degree before Bruce's death in 1329. And it's a tale of a king who comes almost not quite from nothing, but ends up in a completely different place. And again, there's so many myths that surround Bruce, who's something of a Scottish national hero, that I'm fascinated in kind of looking into Bruce in much more detail. And so I'm hoping that my next book, my next project, will be a biography on Robert the Bruce. So let's kind of watch this space on that one, I think.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be a great book. All right, and you had mentioned your website, 14th Century Fiend. Is there anywhere else? Is that the best place to contact you online or connect with you if your fans want to see what you're working on?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been running for about a year now, and I try and post regularly every week or 2 weeks. I also run a series on that, which is called A Writer's Journey. So I'm quite honest about this writing experience for me. What are the highs and the lows been, and what are the pitfalls that I've come across and fallen into and kind of dragged myself out of. So that's all charted on the blog. And I also say I write weekly or fortnightly articles about things related to the 14th century or Edward II or his court. So that's probably a good place to get me. And there's a contact button there. And I always love talking to readers. There's nothing better, actually, because I think you learn so much from other people, and particularly readers who pose really interesting questions. And so any question, whatever that may be, by all means, get in touch. I'm also on Twitter. So my address is @Spinks Stephen. So Spinks is Spinks, which is my surname. So you can find me on Twitter, and I post there. And I'm also on Facebook. And that's 14th Century Fiend. So there are a few places to find me, actually. And I'm always looking to talk about Edward II. So if anybody wants to, then please do get in touch.
All right. Is there any last words you'd like to say to your fans out there?
First and foremost, a huge thank you, because in the last 2 years, whilst I've been writing my book and running the blog, there's been so many people who have given me words of encouragement and support, and equally those people who have only just recently come across me and are out buying books and wanting to know more about Edward II. It's just an enormous thank you to all of you for all of that ongoing support, and hopefully for those people who are yet to pick up a book or see my blog or follow me on Twitter would be great. And I suppose my final thought is just that history is an enormously great subject, and it has so many twists, turns and counter turns and counter plots in it. And I've always found history to be really infectious for its skullduggery and the highs and lows of what happens in history, whichever period you are interested in. And I've met lots of people in my time who said, I really wish I had been more interested in history at school, or I had a teacher that I didn't get on with at school, and so I wasn't really interested, and I really regret that. Actually, it doesn't matter what your experiences are in the past. If you're really interested in history, just pick up a book and get writing. And equally, if you are one of those people like your own readers at Medieval Archives who are really into history, go out there and talk about it, enthuse about it, be really geeky and nerdy about it, because I'm really geeky and nerdy about it. And actually what that means is you inspire people with your passion, and the passion is infectious. And so the more we do that, the more the world, the medieval world, gets opened up, and the more we can talk about really exciting stories like Edward II. So I would say go for it, enjoy it, and love it.
Stephen, thank you for your time. It was a fascinating talk about Edward II, and we appreciate you taking the time out to talk to us on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
And once again, I'd like to thank Stephen for taking the time to come on the show. He's an authority on Edward II and provided a lot of information. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can pick up a copy of his book from Amberley Publishing or on Amazon, and all those links to his sites and his book will be found at medievalarchives.com/78. Edward II the Man is a great biography on a medieval king that should not be overlooked. Now, what did you think of the talk? What are your thoughts on Edward's reign and his fate? Send your comments and questions to podcast@medievalarchives.com. To keep up to date with all the medieval news and podcasts, consider signing up for our newsletter at medievalarchives.com/subscribe. Don't forget to check out our website at medievalarchives.com. Thanks for your time, and thanks for your continued support. That's going to wrap it up for this week. Thanks again for subscribing and listening to the Medieval Archives podcast, illuminating the dark ages for the digital world.
The Medieval Archives Podcast, the podcast for medieval news, history, and entertainment. If you have any questions, comments, topic ideas, or would like to sponsor an episode, send an email to podcast@medievalarchives.com. Audio files are welcome. You can call in your question or comment to 720-722-1066. International and long-distance charges may apply. Visit Medieval Archives at medievalarchives.com. You can also follow Medieval Archives on Facebook at facebook.com/Medieval Archives and on Twitter at twitter.com/Medieval Archive for all your daily medieval updates.